Jeffrey Edward Epstein was born on January 20th, 1953, in Brooklyn, New York, to a working-class Jewish family. His father worked for the New York City Parks Department, and his mother was a homemaker. There was nothing in Epstein's early environment that clearly foreshadowed the global scandal his name would later represent. By most accounts, he was an intelligent child with a strong aptitude for mathematics, a subject that would shape his earliest professional opportunities. Epstein attended Lafayette High School in Brooklyn, a public school known for producing academically gifted students. Teachers noted his sharp intellect, particularly in math and science. After graduating in 1971, he enrolled at Cooper Union, a tuition-free college in Manhattan known for its rigorous engineering and science programs. He later transferred to New York University's Courant Institute of Mathematical Sciences, one of the most prestigious math departments in the country. However, Epstein never completed a college degree. Despite this, in 1974, at just 21 years old, Epstein secured a job teaching mathematics and physics at the Dalton School, one of Manhattan's most elite private schools. Dalton catered to the children of powerful families in finance, politics, and media. How Epstein obtained this position without a degree remains unclear, but former administrators later suggested that recommendations and his apparent brilliance played a role. At Dalton, Epstein taught the sons of wealthy and influential families. Among the parents were executives from Wall Street firms and figures embedded in New York's upper class. This environment placed Epstein in close proximity to power at an unusually young age. He was not merely teaching equations. He was learning how wealth moved, how influence operated, and how elite social networks functioned. Epstein's tenure at Dalton ended abruptly in 1976 after concerns were raised about his conduct, though details were never fully disclosed publicly. What is clear is that Epstein left teaching and moved directly into the financial world, an extraordinary transition for someone with no degree, no formal credentials, and no prior finance experience. His entry into finance came through Bear Stearns, one of Wall Street's most prominent investment banks at the time. Epstein began working as a junior assistant and quickly rose through the ranks. By the early 1980s, he had become a limited partner at the firm. Colleagues later described him as confident, secretive, and unusually well-connected for someone so young. At Bear Stearns, Epstein specialized in advising wealthy clients on tax strategies, asset protection, and financial structuring. His work required discretion and trust, qualities highly valued among the ultra-rich. However, his time at the firm ended in 1981 under murky circumstances. Bear Stearns later stated that Epstein violated company policies, though no criminal allegations were made at that time. What followed was the most mysterious chapter of Epstein's rise. Epstein founded his own firm, J. Epstein and Company, which he claimed served only clients with a net worth exceeding $1 billion. This was highly unusual. Even more unusual was the firm's apparent lack of transparency. Epstein did not publicly disclose his client list, business model, or investment strategies. Yet, somehow, his wealth grew rapidly. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, Epstein had amassed extraordinary assets. A sprawling Manhattan mansion on East 71st Street, the largest private residence in the city. A private island in the U.S. Virgin Islands known as Little St. James. Properties in Florida, New Mexico, Paris, and later another Virgin Islands estate. Private jets and a lifestyle rivaling that of established billionaires. Despite this, journalists and financial analysts struggled to explain how Epstein made his money. One confirmed source of his wealth was his close relationship with Leslie Wexner, the billionaire founder of L Brands, the parent company of Victoria's Secret. Epstein became Wexner's financial advisor and was granted extraordinary authority over Wexner's finances. In 1991, Wexner signed over power of attorney to Epstein, an almost unheard of move for someone of his status. Through Wexner, Epstein gained entry into an even higher tier of global influence. He was now moving comfortably among heads of state, royalty, scientists, politicians, and business magnates. His guest list included former presidents, foreign princes, Nobel Prize winning academics, and Silicon Valley executives. By the mid-1990s, Epstein had carefully constructed an image, a reclusive financier, a patron of science, a man with connections everywhere, Yet accountability nowhere. He donated millions to universities, including Harvard, where he cultivated relationships with prominent researchers. He positioned himself as a benefactor to intellectual progress, funding conferences and research initiatives. This philanthropic persona helped insulate him from scrutiny and allowed him access to institutions that rarely asked hard questions of their donors. At the same time, Epstein's personal life remained largely hidden. He never married, had no publicly acknowledged long-term relationships, and maintained strict control over his residences. Employees later describe a culture of silence, rigid loyalty, and secrecy. By the early 2000s, Epstein had achieved something rare. He was immensely wealthy, globally connected, and virtually unknown to the general public. But that anonymity would not last. In 2005, a complaint filed in Palm Beach, Florida, would begin unraveling the carefully constructed world Epstein had built. A minor reported that she had been brought to Epstein's home and paid for what she described as inappropriate conduct. The allegation prompted a police investigation, one that would soon reveal a pattern, not an isolated incident. Palm Beach detectives interviewed multiple young women. Their statements showed striking similarities: recruitment through acquaintances, payment in cash, and repeated visits to Epstein's residence. What investigators were uncovering was not just misconduct, but a system. As law enforcement quietly expanded its inquiry, Epstein continued to live openly among the elite, attending dinners, hosting guests, and traveling freely. Few outside the investigation knew anything was wrong. This was the moment where two realities began to collide: the public image of a powerful financier and the private findings of a growing criminal investigation. By early 2005, Jeffrey Epstein had spent nearly 3 decades building a life defined by access, wealth, and insulation from scrutiny. That insulation began to fracture in Palm Beach, Florida, a wealthy coastal town where Epstein owned a large estate and maintained a steady presence. What initially appeared to local authorities as a single complaint would soon expose a pattern that investigators found deeply troubling. The case began when the stepmother of a 14-year-old girl contacted the Palm Beach Police Department. She reported that her stepdaughter had been paid to give a massage to a wealthy man at his residence. According to the complaint, the encounter escalated into inappropriate sexual conduct. The girl described being paid in cash and encouraged to recruit other girls for similar visits. Palm Beach police took the allegations seriously. Detective Joseph Epstein was assigned to the case and began interviewing potential witnesses. Over the following weeks, investigators spoke with multiple girls, some minors, others just over the age of 18, who independently described nearly identical experiences. Their accounts followed a consistent pattern. The girls said they were recruited through friends or acquaintances. They were offered money to provide massages at Epstein's home. Once inside, the encounters allegedly crossed boundaries, often involving sexual acts. Payments were typically made in cash, and several girls said they were encouraged to bring others, creating what detectives later described as a recruitment pipeline. By the summer of 2005, Palm Beach police had identified more than a dozen alleged victims. Detectives documented statements, phone records, and travel logs. They also gathered corroborating details that aligned with the girls' accounts: descriptions of rooms inside Epstein's residence, routines, and payment methods. The investigation expanded rapidly. Police prepared a detailed report recommending felony charges, including unlawful sexual activity with minor. In July 2005, Palm Beach Police Chief Michael Ryder formally submitted the case to the Palm Beach County State Attorney's Office. Given the number of alleged victims and the consistency of their statements, local detectives expected aggressive prosecution. What happened next would later become one of the most controversial prosecutorial decisions in recent U.S. history. The case was transferred to the Office of State Attorney Barry Krischer. After reviewing the materials, Krischer declined to pursue felony charges at the state level. Instead, the case was referred to federal authorities, specifically the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of Florida. That office was led by Alexander Acosta. Federal prosecutors conducted their own review. They interviewed witnesses and evaluated whether Epstein could be charged under federal statutes related to sex trafficking and exploitation of minors. At this stage, Epstein had assembled a formidable legal defense team, including prominent attorneys with deep political and legal connections. In 2007, Rather than pursuing a federal indictment, Acosta's office negotiated a non-prosecution agreement with Epstein's attorneys. The agreement was extraordinary in scope. Under its terms, Epstein would plead guilty to 2 state-level prostitution-related charges, one involving a minor. In exchange, federal prosecutors agreed not to charge Epstein or any unnamed co-conspirators federally. The agreement also stipulated that Epstein would serve a jail sentence, but under highly unusual conditions. In 2008, Epstein was sentenced to 18 months in the Palm Beach County Jail. However, he was granted work release for up to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. During that time, he was allowed to leave the jail, travel to his office, and return in the evening. He ultimately served about 13 months under these conditions. To many observers, the outcome appeared starkly disproportionate to the allegations. Even more troubling to critics was how the agreement was handled. The alleged victims were not informed of the deal before it was finalized, a potential violation of Crime Victims' Rights Act. Years later, this omission would become central to legal challenges and public outrage. Despite pleading guilty, Epstein was required to register as a sex offender. However, the designation did little to restrict his movements. After his release, he resumed international travel, hosted guests at his properties, and maintained relationships with powerful figures across politics, business, and academia. For nearly a decade, the case faded from public view. Epstein rarely spoke about the charges. When asked, he characterized the matter as resolved and continued to present himself as a wealthy financier and philanthropist. Institutions accepted his donations. Universities welcomed his funding. Invitations continued. But inside the justice system, the case never fully disappeared. In 2014, investigative reporting by the Miami Herald reopened scrutiny of the Palm Beach case. Journalist Julie K. Brown published a series of articles that re-examined the original investigation, the plea deal, and the experiences of the victims. Her reporting identified dozens of women who said they had been victimized by Epstein, many of whom had never been contacted by authorities. The articles detailed how the non-prosecution agreement was negotiated in secret and how victims were kept uninformed. They also highlighted internal disagreements among law enforcement officials, some of whom believed the case had been undermined by Epstein's influence and resources. Public reaction was swift and intense. Civil lawsuits followed. Victims challenged the legality of the 2008 agreement, arguing that their rights had been violated. A federal judge later ruled that prosecutors had indeed failed to notify victims, though the ruling did not immediately undo the plea deal. As scrutiny intensified, attention turned to Epstein's associates and enablers, those who had helped manage his finances, properties, and daily operations. Among them was Ghislaine Maxwell, a longtime companion, who would later face her own legal reckoning. By 2018, the Epstein case had re-entered the national conversation. What once appeared to be a closed chapter was now widely viewed as a symbol of systemic failure, an example of how wealth and power could distort justice. The groundwork was being laid for a second, far more consequential confrontation with the legal system. By mid-2019, Jeffrey Epstein's name had once again become synonymous with unanswered questions and unresolved justice. Years of investigative reporting, civil lawsuits, and mounting public pressure had forced federal authorities to re-examine a case that many believed should never have been allowed to fade into obscurity. This time, the response would be decisive. On July 6, 2019, Epstein was arrested at Teterboro Airport in New Jersey after returning from Paris aboard his private jet. Federal agents took him into custody without incident. 2 days later, the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York unsealed an indictment charging Epstein with sex trafficking of minors and conspiracy to commit sex trafficking. Unlike the earlier Palm Beach case, the charges were federal felonies carrying potential sentences of up to 45 years in prison. Prosecutors alleged that between 2002 and 2005, Epstein had sexually exploited dozens of underage girls at his properties in Manhattan and Palm Beach. According to the indictment, Epstein maintained a system in which minors were recruited, groomed, and paid to engage in sexual acts, often under the guise of providing massages. The indictment also emphasized the role of employees and associates who allegedly facilitated these encounters. The arrest sent shockwaves through political, financial, and social circles worldwide. Within hours, Epstein's Manhattan mansion was searched by federal agents. Photographs released later showed investigators removing boxes of evidence. Among the items reportedly seized were computer hard drives, photographs, and documents that prosecutors believed could establish patterns of abuse and identify potential co-conspirators. Epstein was denied bail at his initial court appearance. Prosecutors argued that he posed an extreme flight risk, citing his private jets, foreign residences, and vast financial resources. Epstein's defense team countered that he was willing to post a substantial bond and submit to house arrest. A federal judge rejected the proposal, ordering Epstein held without bail at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan. For the first time in his adult life, Epstein was confined to a federal jail. The case immediately attracted international attention. Media organizations dissected Epstein's past, re-examining his relationships with politicians, royalty, business leaders, and academics. Institutions that had once accepted his donations scrambled to distance themselves. Universities reviewed their ties. Foundations issued statements. Some returned funds. Others launched internal investigations. At the center of the renewed scrutiny were the victims. Federal prosecutors publicly acknowledged the women who had come forward, emphasizing that the case was built on their testimony. Many survivors expressed a cautious sense of relief, describing the arrest as long overdue. Civil attorneys representing victims reported a surge in new inquiries from women who had never previously spoken to law enforcement. Epstein himself remained largely silent. Through his attorneys, he pleaded not guilty to all charges. His defense strategy appeared focused on procedural challenges, including arguments related to the 2008 non-prosecution agreement. Prosecutors, however, maintained that the earlier deal did not bind the Southern District of New York and had no bearing on the new indictment. As the legal process moved forward, questions about Epstein's health and safety began to surface. On July 23, 2019, Epstein was found injured in his jail cell with marks on his neck. Officials initially described the incident as a possible suicide attempt, though Epstein's lawyers later suggested he had been assaulted by another inmate. Epstein was placed on suicide watch and temporarily moved to a different housing unit. After several days, he was returned to the general population. The Metropolitan Correctional Center, already under scrutiny for staffing shortages and deteriorating conditions, now found itself responsible for one of the most high-profile detainees in the country. Critics questioned whether the facility was adequately equipped to ensure Epstein's safety or preserve the integrity of the legal process. Meanwhile, prosecutors continued preparing their case. They signaled that additional charges could follow and that the investigation remained active. Public interest intensified around the possibility that others might be implicated. Though no additional indictments were announced at that time, officials stressed that the case was ongoing and far from concluded. Then, on August 10, 2019, the case took a dramatic and irreversible turn. Early that morning, Epstein was found unresponsive in his cell. Attempts to revive him were unsuccessful. He was pronounced dead at a nearby hospital. The New York City Medical Examiner later ruled his death a suicide by hanging. Epstein was 66 years old. The news sparked immediate and widespread reaction. For many victims, the announcement brought anger, grief, and a sense of profound injustice. Epstein would never face a jury. There would be no trial, no cross-examination, no public accounting of the evidence. Public officials demanded answers. The U.S. Attorney General ordered an investigation into the circumstances surrounding Epstein's death. The Federal Bureau of Prisons placed several employees on administrative leave. Reports later revealed that required checks had not been conducted as scheduled, and that staffing shortages had compromised oversight. In November 2019, the Department of Justice released findings confirming serious failures at the facility. Disciplinary action followed, though the broader systemic issues remained a subject of debate. Epstein's death did not end the legal consequences of his actions. Civil lawsuits against his estate moved forward. In 2020, Epstein's estate established a compensation program for victims, funded with hundreds of millions of dollars. More than 100 women came forward, and many received financial settlements. While some survivors viewed the program as a measure of accountability, others emphasized that no amount of money could replace justice. Attention also turned increasingly to Epstein's associates. Ghislaine Maxwell, long described as a close companion and alleged facilitator, was arrested in July 2020. Prosecutors accused her of helping recruit and groom underage girls for Epstein. Her arrest marked a continuation of the reckoning that Epstein's death had not erased. By the end of 2019, the Epstein case had evolved into something larger than one man. It had become a symbol of institutional failure, prosecutorial discretion, and the consequences of unequal justice. It raised enduring questions about how power shields wrongdoing, and how long it can do so before public scrutiny forces accountability. Jeffrey Epstein's death in August 2019 marked the end of the criminal case against him, but did not end the legal, institutional, or public reckoning that followed. Instead, his death shifted attention outward, away from a single defendant and toward the systems, organizations, and individuals that had enabled him to operate for years with minimal consequence. Almost immediately, questions arose about how a high-profile detainee facing serious federal charges could die while in custody. The Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan, where Epstein was held, came under intense scrutiny. The facility had long been criticized for chronic understaffing, aging infrastructure, and lapses in inmate supervision. Subsequent investigations by the Department of Justice's Office of the Inspector General found that Epstein was not checked as frequently as required, that surveillance cameras malfunctioned, and that guards assigned to his unit had failed to follow established procedures. The report concluded that a combination of negligence, staffing shortages, and management failures contributed to the circumstances surrounding Epstein's death. While disciplinary actions were taken against several Bureau of Prisons employees, critics argued that accountability stopped short of addressing broader systemic problems. Calls for prison reform intensified, with lawmakers citing Epstein's case as evidence of deep structural flaws in federal detention facilities. At the same time, attention turned to Epstein's estate. In the months following his death, civil lawsuits filed by victims continued to move through the courts. These suits sought damages from Epstein's estate, alleging years of abuse and exploitation. In response, the executors of the estate established the Epstein Victims Compensation Program in 2020. The program was funded with approximately $120 million from Epstein's assets and was designed to compensate survivors without requiring them to endure lengthy court battles. Over 100 women submitted claims. Independent administrators reviewed each case, and payments were issued to those deemed eligible. For some survivors, the compensation represented a measure of acknowledgement and financial relief. For others, it was a painful reminder that the criminal justice system had failed to deliver a public trial or formal verdict. Many emphasized that the program, while significant, could not replace accountability or truth. As civil proceedings continued, journalists and legal experts revisited the decisions that had shaped Epstein's earlier treatment by the justice system, particularly the 2008 non-prosecution agreement in Florida. Alexander Acosta, who had approved the deal as U.S. attorney, faced renewed criticism. In 2019, amid mounting public pressure, Acosta resigned from his position as U.S. Secretary of Labor. During a press conference, he defended his earlier actions, stating that he believed the agreement had secured justice at the time. His explanation did little to quell controversy. The case became a reference point in debates over prosecutorial discretion, transparency, and victims' rights. Legal scholars cited Epstein's plea deal as an example of how unequal power dynamics could influence outcomes. Advocacy groups pushed for reforms to ensure that victims are notified and consulted in cases involving negotiated agreements. Parallel to the legal fallout was a cultural reckoning. Institutions that had accepted Epstein's money, universities, nonprofits, and research organizations, faced questions about due diligence and ethical responsibility. Some returned donations. Others launched internal reviews or removed Epstein's name from buildings and programs. The scrutiny extended to prominent individuals who had associated with Epstein socially or professionally, though most denied knowledge of his criminal behavior. This period also saw an expansion of investigative reporting. Journalists continued to publish detailed examinations of Epstein's finances, properties, and network of associates. Court documents were unsealed, revealing flight logs, contact lists, and correspondence that shed light on the breadth of Epstein's social connections. While these records did not establish criminal liability for others, they underscored how deeply Epstein had embedded himself within elite circles. Central to the ongoing story was Ghislaine Maxwell. Long described as Epstein's closest associate, Maxwell was arrested in July 2020 on federal charges related to recruitment and exploitation of minors. Prosecutors allege that she played a key role in facilitating Epstein's abuse by identifying, grooming, and managing victims. Her arrest was widely viewed as the most direct continuation of the criminal accountability that Epstein himself had avoided through death. Maxwell's case would later proceed to trial, placing the Epstein network back under the spotlight and forcing a public examination of events that had long remained hidden. Beyond individual prosecutions, the Epstein case left a lasting impact on public trust. Polls and commentary reflected widespread skepticism about whether the justice system treated wealthy defendants differently. For many observers, Epstein's story became emblematic of a broader concern that access to money, lawyers, and influence could delay or derail accountability. Survivors' advocates stressed that Epstein's victims were not ignored because of a lack of evidence, but because their voices carried less weight than the power of the man they accused. Their stories became central to discussions about consent, exploitation, and the vulnerabilities faced by minors in unequal power relationships. In legislatures and courtrooms, Epstein's name was increasingly invoked in support of reform. Proposals included stronger enforcement of the Crime Victims' Rights Act, increased oversight of federal detention facilities, and greater transparency in prosecutorial agreements. By the early 2020s, it was clear that Jeffrey Epstein's legacy would not be defined solely by his crimes, but by the institutional failures that allowed those crimes to continue unchecked for years. The question was no longer only what Epstein had done, but how many warning signs had been missed, how many opportunities for intervention had been ignored, and how many systems had prioritized discretion over accountability. As legal cases continued and public scrutiny remained intense, the Epstein story entered a new phase, one focused less on a single individual and more on the broader implications of power, protection, and justice. By the time Jeffrey Epstein's name became permanently etched into public consciousness, the focus had expanded far beyond the man himself. His death had closed the door on a criminal trial, but opened a wider examination of the network that surrounded him. Those who enabled his lifestyle, benefited from his wealth, or failed to intervene when warning signs were evident. At the center of this next phase was Ghislaine Maxwell. Maxwell, a British socialite and the daughter of publishing magnate Robert Maxwell, had been a visible presence in Epstein's life for years. She appeared in photographs with him, managed properties, and introduced him to influential figures. Federal prosecutors alleged that Maxwell was not a passive associate, but an active participant in Epstein's crimes. In July 2020, Maxwell was arrested at a secluded property in New Hampshire. She was charged with multiple federal offenses, including conspiracy to entice minors to travel for illegal sexual acts and perjury related to earlier civil testimony. Prosecutors argued that Maxwell played a key role in recruiting, grooming, and managing underage girls for Epstein between the mid-1990s and early 2000s. Her arrest marked a significant turning point. For the first time, a close associate of Epstein would face a public trial. Survivors who had long sought accountability now had an opportunity to testify in open court. The case also promised to illuminate how Epstein's operation functioned day to day, how girls were recruited, how staff were instructed, and how silence was enforced. Maxwell pleaded not guilty to all charges. Her trial began in late 2021 in federal court in Manhattan. Over several weeks, jurors heard testimony from multiple women who described being recruited as teenagers and introduced to Epstein through Maxwell. Their accounts echoed patterns seen in earlier investigations: promises of money, normalization of inappropriate behavior, and gradual escalation. Prosecutors presented evidence including flight records, photographs, and testimony from former employees. The government argued that Maxwell acted as a gatekeeper, identifying vulnerable girls, gaining their trust, and delivering them into Epstein's control. The defense countered that Maxwell was being scapegoated for Epstein's actions. Her attorneys argued that witnesses' memories were unreliable and that prosecutors were attempting to rewrite history to compensate for Epstein's absence. In December 2021, after days of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict. Ghislaine Maxwell was found guilty on multiple counts related to the exploitation of minors. In 2022, she was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. The conviction was widely viewed as a rare moment of accountability in a case long defined by its absence. For many survivors, the verdict offered a measure of validation. However, the trial also underscored the limits of the justice system's reach. Despite extensive testimony about Epstein's social circle and operations, no additional criminal charges were filed against other high-profile individuals. Prosecutors emphasized that association alone was not evidence of criminal conduct, and that charges require proof beyond a reasonable doubt. This distinction became a source of frustration for the public. Court documents, flight logs, and contact lists revealed the breadth of Epstein's connections: politicians, business leaders, academics, and celebrities. While these records demonstrated access and proximity, they did not establish criminal liability. Law enforcement agencies repeatedly stated that investigations were ongoing, but years passed without further indictments. In civil court, however, accountability continued to take a different form. Several high-profile settlements were reached between Epstein's victims and institutions or individuals accused of enabling him. In some cases, financial institutions faced lawsuits alleging they ignored red flags while managing Epstein's accounts. Banks denied wrongdoing but, in some instances, agreed to settlements without admitting liability. These cases reinforced a central theme of the Epstein saga: that systems designed to prevent abuse often failed when confronted with wealth and influence. Media coverage during this period played a critical role. Investigative journalists continued to analyze newly unsealed documents, interview survivors, and trace financial and institutional ties. Their reporting kept public attention focused on the broader implications of the case, even as criminal proceedings narrowed. The Epstein story also left a lasting imprint on public discourse. It reshaped conversations about consent, exploitation, and power. Advocacy organizations cited the case when pushing for reforms related to sex trafficking laws, statute of limitations extensions, and protections for minors. Universities and nonprofits tightened donor vetting procedures. Corporations reviewed compliance policies to ensure that allegations of abuse would not be overlooked. Perhaps most significantly, the case altered how society viewed the relationship between wealth and justice. For many observers, Epstein's rise in relative impunity exposed uncomfortable truths about how institutions respond to allegations when powerful individuals are involved. The contrast between the treatment of Epstein and that of less affluent defendants became a recurring point in debates about equality before the law. Survivors remained at the center of this evolving legacy. Many continue to speak publicly, emphasizing that their goal extended beyond personal compensation. They call for structural change, clearer reporting mechanisms, stronger enforcement, and a cultural shift toward believing and protecting vulnerable individuals. By the mid-2020s, Jeffrey Epstein's name had become shorthand for institutional failure, not because his crimes were unprecedented, but because the warning signs had been visible for years. Teachers, police officers, journalists, and advocates had raised concerns at different moments. Yet meaningful intervention came late, and justice arrived incompletely. The network surrounding Epstein, legal, financial, and social, did not collapse overnight. Instead, it slowly unraveled under sustained scrutiny, lawsuits, and public pressure. The process revealed how deeply interconnected power structures can obscure wrongdoing. As the legal cases wound down, a final question lingered. What lessons, if any, would endure? Would institutions change how they respond to allegations involving influential figures? Would victims' voices carry greater weight in future cases? Or would Epstein's story become another cautionary tale, remembered but not fully acted upon? As the criminal cases related to Jeffrey Epstein reached their legal conclusions, the focus shifted toward what, if anything, would change as a result. Epstein's story had exposed weaknesses across multiple institutions: law enforcement, corrections, financial systems, academia, and philanthropy. The question confronting policymakers and the public alike was whether those failures would lead to lasting reform or fade once public attention moved on. One of the most immediate areas of scrutiny was prosecutorial discretion. The 2008 non-prosecution agreement in Florida became a case study in how plea negotiations can undermine public confidence when conducted without transparency. Legal scholars and advocacy groups argue that the secrecy surrounding the deal and exclusion of victims from the process violated not only the spirit but the intent of federal victims' rights laws. In response, lawmakers renewed efforts to strengthen enforcement of the Crime Victims' Rights Act. Proposed reforms emphasize mandatory notification of victims, clearer judicial oversight of non-prosecution agreements, and penalty for officers that fail to comply. While critics noted that laws already existed, supporters argued that Epstein's case demonstrated the need for stronger accountability mechanisms. The federal detention system also faced renewed examination. Investigations into Epstein's death highlighted chronic understaffing, outdated infrastructure, and inconsistent oversight within the Bureau of Prisons. Congressional hearings followed, with officials testifying about budget constraints, recruitment challenges, and facility maintenance issues. Epstein's case was repeatedly cited as an example of how systemic neglect could have fatal consequences, both for inmates and for public trust. Although some reforms were proposed, including increased funding and improved monitoring technology, progress was uneven. Advocacy groups stressed that without sustained political pressure, structural problems would remain unresolved. Financial institutions were another focal point. Civil lawsuits alleged that banks and financial service providers failed to act on warning signs related to Epstein's accounts. Internal documents revealed compliance concerns that were raised but not acted upon decisively. In response to public scrutiny, major financial institutions announced reviews of anti-money laundering protocols and customer due diligence procedures. Some banks agreed to settlements, emphasizing that they did not admit wrongdoing, but acknowledging the need for improved safeguards. Regulators pointed to these cases as reminders that financial compliance systems play a critical role in identifying and disrupting exploitive networks. Academic and nonprofit institutions also reckon with their role. Epstein's donations to universities and research programs raise questions about how institutions vet donors and manage reputational risk. In the years following his arrest, several universities implemented stricter donor review policies, established ethics committees, and pledged greater transparency in funding sources. These measures were framed not only as safeguards against future scandals, but as acknowledgments that prestige and funding should not override ethical responsibility. Culturally, the Epstein case reshaped public conversations about power and accountability. The case coincided with broader movements addressing sexual exploitation and abuse, reinforcing calls to believe survivors and challenge systems that protect influential offenders. Epstein's story was frequently referenced in discussions about consent, grooming, and the vulnerability of minors in environments shaped by inequality. Survivors' voices remain central. Many continue to advocate for reforms beyond their own cases, emphasizing prevention and early intervention. They highlighted the importance of education, accessible reporting mechanisms, and support services for at-risk youth. Their advocacy underscored a critical lesson of the Epstein saga, that exploitation often persists not because it is hidden, but because it is ignored. At the same time, skepticism remained. Some observers questioned whether reforms inspired by Epstein's case would endure. History offered examples of scandals that prompted temporary outrage, but limited long-term change. Critics warned that without sustained oversight, institutional memory would fade and old patterns would reemerge. Legal experts also debated the broader implications of the case for justice itself. Epstein's ability to avoid a full criminal trial became a symbol of unequal accountability. For many, it reinforced the perception that wealth and influence can distort legal outcomes. This perception, experts warned, poses a long-term risk to public faith in the rule of law. In response, some prosecutors' offices began emphasizing transparency and victim engagement in high-profile cases. Training programs were updated, and internal guidelines were revised to address conflict of interest and public accountability. While these steps were incremental, they reflected an awareness of the damage caused when justice appears selective. By the mid-2020s, the Epstein case had become more than a criminal narrative. It was a reference point. It appeared in court opinions, academic studies, policy debates, and media analyses. It was cited when discussing plea bargaining, prison reform, donor ethics, and corporate compliance. Its legacy extended beyond its facts into the realm of institutional self-examination. Yet, for all the reforms proposed and discussion sparked, one reality remained unchanged. No trial ever fully examined Jeffrey Epstein's conduct in open court. No comprehensive public record tested evidence, weighed testimony, or rendered a verdict on the totality of his actions. For many survivors, this absence remained the deepest injustice. The future of accountability, they argued, depended not only on new laws or policies, but on a cultural willingness to confront abuse early, before power has time to shield it. As the public reckoning gradually receded, the final chapter of the Epstein story came into focus: how history would remember the case, and whether its lessons would shape responses to future abuses of power. By the time the legal proceedings connected to Jeffrey Epstein largely came to an end, his case had already entered history as something more than a single criminal scandal. It had become a defining example of how power, privilege, and institutional failure can intersect, often with devastating consequences for those with the least protection. Epstein's story was not extraordinary because of secrecy alone. Many of the warning signs were visible long before his arrest in 2019. Allegations were reported to police, documented by investigators, and supported by witness testimony as early as the mid-2000s. What made the case exceptional was how those warnings failed to produce lasting intervention. For years, Epstein moved freely despite credible allegations. He maintained access to wealth, travel, and influence, even after pleading guilty to a crime involving a minor. Institutions that might have acted as safeguards, law enforcement agencies, financial regulators, academic organizations, either lacked the tools, the authority, or the willingness to challenge him decisively. The absence of full criminal trial became the case's most enduring gap. Without a trial, there was no single public forum where evidence could be tested, witnesses cross-examined, and responsibility clearly assigned. For survivors, this meant the loss of a formal reckoning. For the public, it meant unanswered questions about how Epstein amassed his wealth, how his operation functioned in detail, and how many opportunities for intervention were missed. In this sense, Epstein's death did not resolve the case. It froze it. What followed instead was a fragmented form of accountability. Civil settlements acknowledged harm but did not establish criminal guilt. Institutional reviews admitted failures, but rarely assigned individual responsibility. Reforms were proposed, debated, and unevenly implemented. Yet the impact of the case should not be measured only by what failed to happen. One of the most significant outcomes of the Epstein saga was the elevation of survivor testimony. Women who had once been dismissed or ignored were eventually heard, documented, and believed. Their persistence reshaped public understanding of exploitation, grooming, and consent, particularly when power imbalances are involved. Their voices also shifted journalistic practice. Investigative reporting played a decisive role in reopening the Epstein case, demonstrating how sustained scrutiny can challenge official narratives and force accountability where legal systems stall. The case reaffirmed the press's role as an essential check on institutional power. For institutions, Epstein became a cautionary reference. Universities revisited donor ethics. Financial institutions strengthened compliance frameworks. Prosecutors faced renewed pressure to justify discretionary decisions. Correctional systems confronted long-standing vulnerabilities that could no longer be dismissed as isolated failures. Whether these changes will endure remains uncertain. History suggests that reform often follows scandal, but persistence determines its longevity. The Epstein case will test whether lessons learned under intense public scrutiny translate into lasting institutional memory, or whether they fade once attention shifts elsewhere. At its core, the Epstein case exposed a fundamental tension within modern justice systems: the gap between formal equality before the law and lived reality. When defendants possess extraordinary resources, that gap can widen, delaying accountability and eroding trust. For many observers, Epstein's story became symbolic, not because his crimes were unique, but because the response to them was so uneven. The final measure of the case may lie not in its verdicts, but in its influence. Will future victims be heard sooner? Will institutions act before harm becomes systemic? Will power be met with oversight rather than deference? These questions remain unresolved. Jeffrey Epstein is no longer alive, but the conditions that allowed his rise, unchecked access, institutional silence, and delayed accountability, persist in many forms. Whether his case becomes a turning point or a warning unheeded will depend on how its lessons are applied. In the end, the Epstein story is not only about one man's crimes. It is about the responsibility of systems designed to protect the vulnerable and what happens when they fail. If you've watched this entire series, thank you for staying with the facts and the voices that matter. Stories like this only have impact when they're examined carefully, without distortion or distraction. If you value long-form, evidence-based true crime documentaries that focus on accountability rather than spectacle, consider subscribing to the channel. Your support allows these stories to be researched, presented responsibly, and remembered. Share this series if you believe difficult truths deserve attention, and if you think systems should be questioned when they fail the people they're meant to protect. More documented cases, deeper investigations, and fact-driven storytelling are coming.